مرحبا بكم أعزائي المستمعين في حلقة جديدة من بودكاست النادي ومع ضيف جديد انتظرناه طويلا. Greetings, Professor Martin.
Hello.
I'm grateful to have you here, really. So delighted to have you with our listeners.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you.
And we have a lot to discuss, so I'll just start with asking you, who is Professor Martin Stokes?
Well, it's a question I often ask, actually. I'm a professor of music at King's College, London. I've been an academic, actually, for pretty much most of my adult life. I'm a musician, too. I play music. And I started out life aspiring to be a professional performing musician. I have a long-standing interest in the music of the Middle East, particularly the music of Turkey, of the Ottoman world, and the Arab world as well. And that interest goes back many decades now. But I suppose I would introduce myself by saying that I'm a musicologist, and that I'm interested in not just music, but all music.
Mm-hmm. We have a lot of things to tell. So let's take it through the timeline, Martin. Let's start from the beginning.
So you could probably describe my life in 4 sections. Have I got this right? So there was a childhood which took place in the West Midlands, out in the provinces, really in the middle of nowhere in England. Then I became a student at Oxford, where I did my undergraduate degree, my master's and my PhD degree. And then there was a series of academic jobs that I had. I went to Queen's University of Belfast, where I spent 8 years. I then spent 10 years in America. And then I came back to the UK, and I had a job as a professor at Oxford before moving to King's. So that's a way of dividing things up. In a way, these have all been academic jobs. So in a sense, there's something about my professional life that hasn't really changed very much. I wake up in the morning, I go to my university or my college, I find my students, I teach my students, I attend meetings, I go back home, I try and find the time to get on with my own research, and I try and find the time to play music with my friends. But in many ways, I think all of those, the 3 different places that I've worked in, Northern Ireland, in the USA, and back here in England, have all been very different. And I have taught in anthropology departments as well as music departments. I've taught all sorts of things I'm interested in, and I do my research on Middle Eastern music, and I guess we'll have a chance to talk about that as time goes on. But actually the teaching I do is to teach music right across the curriculum, from the medieval period right up to the present day. And I teach I have taught all sorts of technical topics as well as kind of historic and ethnographic topics. So even though the job has been, in some ways, my life has consisted of a series of very mainstream academic jobs, within that space I feel as though I've done quite a lot of different and really rather diverse things.
Interesting. I would rather go to the sections one by one, really, starting with the childhood.
Sure. Okay. Well, it was a long time ago. That was the first thing to say, and really, it's a good place to start because, as for many of us, I suppose, our early childhood really determines so much else of what's going to happened later in life. And I had, in some ways, the extraordinary good fortune to have been born and brought up within very close proximity to a rather unique music school, which I attended from the age of 6 onwards. And this was just a very unusual coincidence because, as I said right at the beginning, where I grew up in Bromyard, Herefordshire, really is, for those of you who know any of your listeners who might know England, I can almost guarantee that they will have no idea where this place is. It really was the back of beyond, where my father had a small farm. So the existence of this music school about 10 miles away was an extraordinary piece of good fortune in some ways. So this was a church music school. It was run by the Anglican Church. It was run by the Church of England. It was run as a foundation, so it sat on a small pile of money, which meant that you applied for a scholarship to go there, and if you got the scholarship, of course, you had a free education. Because it was a Church of England school, the music that you were being taught there was church music, and the idea was that you would then go on to serve the church as a musician for the rest of your life. And it was designed to give you the education that you needed, the training that you needed to be that kind of musician. I should say a little bit more about what this system is, because the system has more or less disappeared. It's more or less gone. It exists in a very reduced form, I suppose you could say, in the United Kingdom at the moment. But it was in some ways an immensely successful institution, these schools. They dated back to the 19th century, to the middle of the 19th century, in which the Anglican Church, so the established church of the United Kingdom, was fighting a kind of battle with another branch of Protestantism called Methodism. And Methodism was a kind of severe, rather doctrinal form of Protestantism, I suppose you could say. And the Church of England had a huge success in recruiting, in converting a lot of people from the working classes in the English cities, which were growing at the time. So the Church of England felt a need to kind of get this working class urban community back as part of the official church. So they launched a kind of initiative, really, to bring these city dwellers back to the true church. This was the way that they saw it, and music was a very important way in which they did this, because they thought that music was going to bring people back into the churches. Right? This was the idea. So they set up these schools all around the country, often attached them to the cathedrals, set up a very rigorous process of musical education and musical training. And in one way or another, that system stayed in place, really, I would have said, until the 1970s, the 1980s, at which point, for various reasons, the secularization, I suppose you could say, of our own society, the schools, all of them hit all sorts of financial problems, and they all started to disappear around the 1980s, including the school that I went to. So this was where I was sent. It revolved first and foremost around church music training, which meant the music of the choirs and the choral tradition. So for the singing of the psalms and for the singing of the services. It meant learning how to direct choirs. This was a very important part of the training. It involved learning how to play the organ, the church organ. This was a very important part of the story. It involved also, even at that young age, it involved understanding that to be a good musician, you had to be a scholar, because a lot of this music still needed to be discovered. And even the school that I went to had this extraordinary library with manuscripts going back to the 16th and the 17th century, right back to the time of the Protestant Reformation. It's just extraordinary that right in the middle of the country, this farming community that I was brought up in, there was this extraordinarily powerful kind of musical institution and resource. So that was where I was sent. I was sent there at the age of 6, and all I can say is that I absolutely did not like being there at all. What child wants to be sent away from home at the age of 6 and sent to boarding school? So I can't describe it as a personally as a very happy experience, but I had the most extraordinary musical education there that you could possibly want. Just from a very early hour in the morning, we used to be got up at 6 o'clock in the morning. You would have a series of choir practices, of instruction and music lessons. You had to go to church twice a day, every single day, morning and evening. Then you would have your normal classes, because you had your normal education as well.
Yeah.
And around that, they would also fit, should we just say, a secular musical education as well. So I learned to play an orchestral instrument and so on and so forth. I often think of myself as being a little bit like those little Romanian and Soviet era gymnasts, and they start training them at the age of 6. And of course, once they've had that training, there's nothing else that they can do for the rest of their lives other than be a kind of gymnast. And actually, in a way, that was my experience of early schooling, was to have this incredibly intense musical training. A training in singing, a training in performing, a training in, just understanding our church musical tradition. So scholarship as well as performance, an ability to, a training in reading music and being able to use musical notation and, read music very, very quickly off the page. This was something that I started doing at the age of 6. And other people in the United Kingdom at that particular moment, if they were starting to learn music, they were encountering all of this kind of formation, this kind of musical formation, much later in life. But I was getting this all at a very, very early age.
So this place has brought up an all well-rounded artist.
I, in a funny kind of a way, despite the very specific purpose for which I was having this musical education, which was to make me a church musician, it did actually produce very capable, I'm not really speaking of myself here, but I'm speaking of many, many other people. It produced, as you say, very well-rounded musicians, people who could get on with the business of making music, doing music, performing music, with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of efficiency, and a complete lack of self-consciousness. So in many ways, despite the fact that I would have to say that I just didn't enjoy being a young boy at a boarding school at all. I was extraordinarily lucky to have had that education. It stayed with me. There's absolutely no question about it.
Yes. Now, talking about that time, maybe moving in the timeline, I'm sure the ecosystem of the religious school or the environment has some remains or some good stuff to stay with you.
Yes, I think that it does. For instance, if you start learning to read and to use musical notation early enough, it becomes just like writing in English or Arabic or something like that. And so that was something that still remains with me. I can hear something, I can transcribe it, I can notate it almost instantly. And it gave you a good ear. I think it gave you a very practical sense of music making. It demystifies in a funny kind of a way. Even though it's a church school, I think its effect on me was to demystify music making, in the sense that, for me, there's no mystery about what's required to assembling a performance, to putting a performance together and making it happen somehow or another, because that, as it were, is something that became second nature to me. I think it also gave me a sense of music as a kind of service, if you want. So this was a kind of philosophy of music making that was not about becoming a big star on the big stage, but developing a kind of professional self dedicated to or devoted to the idea that music is something that we all need. It makes us better as people. It makes us better as a society. Possibly even it makes us better in the eyes of God. Who knows? That there is some point and purpose to this, which is not about you. You know, it instills in you the idea that music is something that you serve, and I think something of that attitude, I think, has remained with me, and in some ways has served me quite well, actually, in my years as a music professor.
Interesting. So carrying on from where we were in this school, it came to the graduation from this school, going to the university, right?
Yeah. So maybe this is one of the slightly more negative aspects about the world of music education in the United Kingdom at that particular moment. So we're talking about the end of the 1960s, the 1970s. I went through high school again on a music scholarship, and that led very naturally in those days to Oxford, which in some ways saw itself then in 1980. The music department there saw itself as very much continuing that kind of trajectory, continuing that kind of philosophy of music education. The church was still, even at secular Oxford, the church was still actually very important. The assumption was that if you were a music student, that probably half of the music students were going to go out and get jobs in churches and cathedrals and in many ways to kind of just carry on doing what they'd already been doing for quite a long time. So in many ways, the Oxford that I went to as an undergraduate student in 1981 was a continuation of something that I've actually been doing since I was 6 years old. It was a very interesting situation to be in because, Oxford being one of the two sort of super elite universities in the country, everybody else who goes there, for them, it's this massive, in some sense, a massive sort of step up in life. It's a very exciting moment because you've reached a kind of pinnacle. But for me, moving from this rather strange boarding school in the country, then to my high school, and then on into Oxford, it all felt terribly continuous to me. It felt as though I hadn't really left a world that I had actually been in since the age of 6. So it made my university years a very interesting kind of experience, I suppose, a rather unique kind of experience.
So what were you doing in Oxford, let's say in the undergrad?
Well, so I think what I remember about being a student and what I remind myself whenever I see a new group of students coming in at the beginning of the year is that the most important things that you learn at university, you don't learn from your professors. You don't learn it from the curriculum. You learn it from one another. You learn it from the culture. You learn it from the culture that undergraduate students create for them. And 1981 was a time of, I think, kind of quite significant change. The 1970s, I think, had been a time of real kind of cultural impoverishment, I would have said, in the United Kingdom. And in the 1980s, for various reasons, I mean, negative reasons as well as positive reasons, there was a kind of sense that things were changing, that things were opening up in some ways, that horizons were just beginning to widen. And what I remember about those years, I think, was encountering other kinds of music. And for me, having been kept in this rather constrained and, for all of its uses and for all of its values, in some ways rather conservative musical environment, for me, aged 19 or however old I was when I started my undergraduate stage of my life, for me, it was all about discovering other kinds of music. I mean, that this was a moment to break out of the kind of constraints in which I'd been. I mean, this is everybody's experience. It should be everybody's experience of their university years, of course. So these were years in which I became hugely interested in folk music. This had been something that goes back quite a long time. I became very interested in jazz. I bought a bass and I played in a jazz band for many years. And it was also the beginning of discovering a world of music outside of the Western European classical and church tradition. So it was the beginning of an encounter with the musics of the world. And obviously enough, I mean, the reason that I'm here talking to you is because that became very, very important to me and ended up just really kind of consuming me, I suppose you could say.
Yeah.
So in many ways, as an undergraduate student, that process of discovery, let's just call it discovery, had already started, I suppose you could say.
What was the trigger to the discovery of the world of music?
I think it was probably, in the first instance, it was probably travel. And so I hadn't traveled very much at that point. And it's probably worth saying that the world outside of England even was very unknown to me. Again, it had something to do with growing up in the provinces in the 1970s in England. Now, I never thought of myself as being poor, quite the reverse. I thought of myself as being privileged and rich in all sorts of ways. But we never had any money. We never had any money. I mean, this was just a constant. So anything that I wanted to do, if I wanted to get on my bike and cycle into Wales and explore on my tent, I would have to find the money to do that. So the idea of traveling in the 1970s for people of my kind of background, even to neighboring countries, to Ireland or to France or to Holland, it was a very, very big deal. Traveling by planes, it was a massively big deal.
Yeah.
So again, what you have to remember is that I'd lived a very provincial life. Compared to the younger generation today, when I compare what my opportunities for travel were to what my kids have grown up with, for example, they were extremely constrained. So everything that involved getting on a train or driving somewhere or even cycling somewhere, let alone getting on a plane, was always going to have a huge impact on me. But somewhere in the middle of my high school years, I travelled around Morocco with a school friend of mine. So this must have been something like 1975, I think it was, quite a long time ago. This made a huge impact on me. And in the year, I think in many ways that determined something. That made me, I think from that point on, fascinated by the Arab world, the world the other side of the Mediterranean. Of course, we couldn't speak a word of Arabic. How on earth would that happen? But we had been taught pretty good French as kids, so we managed to get ourselves around and not get into too much trouble. I didn't hear or I didn't encounter too much music. In fact, what I distinctly remember in 1975 was that all of the Moroccan kids and kids of our own age that we were talking to, all they wanted to talk about was Western pop bands and Western rock bands. And it's funny how vividly I still actually remember those conversations. And then a little bit later, so this was just when I'd finished high school and I was preparing to go to university, I taught for a year and scraped together a little bit of money and decided to go to Turkey, almost randomly. But I figured out I had enough money to be able to get myself there by train, I should say, not by plane, because plane was way too expensive. So train was the way to get there. A 3-day journey from London to Istanbul. And I did that in the 3 months before I started as an undergraduate. And this was a huge turning point, I suppose you could say, in my life. It just gripped me in all sorts of ways. The experience of being outside of Europe at that age was an extremely powerful one. Turkey was in a very strange place at that particular moment. It was just dealing with a military coup. It was the government had been suspended. The country was being run by a military junta. So it was a very vivid experience, I suppose you could say, for me. And it was one that involved a lot of music. Unlike in Morocco in 1975, the young Turkish people that I spoke to seemed to have no point of reference outside their own musical culture. And so if you wanted to talk about music, you had to, as it were, talk on their terms. And so this was decisive in all sorts of ways. I left there on my way to Oxford as undergraduate, thinking I've got to come back here. This is something that I need to learn more about, to find out more about, to understand more about. I thought I could kind of figure out a way of sort of what I needed to do, and I'd already got a plan for the following year. So that was the beginning of a process in which I just started. Like every summer, I would devote the year to scraping together the financial resources that I needed to to getting the money together, with a view to spending 2 months, 3 months, if possible, over the entire summer in Istanbul. And that started in 1980, and that pattern actually continued more or less uninterrupted for about 10 years, right up to 1990.
So I think we'll go into Turkey in detail later on.
Sure.
But I see that you were alert and you had a decision from the beginning. You were devoted to music, I guess, right? You had a
Yes.
decision, you had a plan from the beginning. Is it?
About music in general, in a sense, the decision about music in general was not my decision. It was a decision that had been taken for me, I suppose you could say, because like a 6-year-old child isn't making decisions. It was
All right.
As far as my parents were concerned, it was a wonderful opportunity to me to have an education that I otherwise, I wouldn't have. So, in many ways, it was. I suppose I could say it was their decision. But coming out of the other end of it, thinking about my kind of attitude as I was going into my undergraduate years, that yes, these were decisions. I was going to do something different. I was going to look in different directions. I was going to make some kind of musical life for myself, which was not what I'd had over the course of the 15 years before that.
But you were not influenced by the pop culture or these kinds of music.
I was actually. I would have said I was passionately involved and connected with it. Yes. I described England as a cultural desert in the 1970s, but of course it had an extremely strong rock culture. Extremely strong rock culture. I was very interested in that. I played electric bass. We had a little band. It was terrible, but I did connect with the rock culture, I think, at a very deep level. So yeah, between 1975 and 1980, I suppose you could say, I was listening to a lot of English rock music. Again, I think slightly typical for my generation, that shaded into an interest in English, British folk music, British and Irish folk music, I think I should say. So I was also playing in folk music bands. so these were there, and this was a very important part of my kind of formation. Remember, by the way, that a lot of these rock bands were themselves super interested in the Middle East and the Arab world. I mean, Led Zeppelin were already, working with Arab musicians, weren't they? They were already recording with Arab musicians. So there was a kind of Orientalism, I suppose you could say, in English rock culture, which obviously had something to do with pushing me towards an interest in the music of the Middle East and of the Islamic world. And I would have said, though I'm, passionately involved in and connected with Middle Eastern music, I mean, I don't think that has taken away anything, I think, from my sense of connection with, I don't know, the English, British rock culture, of the British and Irish rock culture and folk musical culture that was kind of thriving in the late 1970s and the late 1980s as well. Jazz came onto the scene again so when I was an undergraduate, of course, as an undergraduate, you want nothing more than to be sophisticated or to be seen as being sophisticated. And what better way to do that than through jazz? And so jazz also became an absolute driving passion, I would have said, in these years. I'm remembering now. It's a while ago, and I haven't really had a chance to dig up these memories. But I was very driven, I think, by jazz as well. But don't forget that jazz too looked to the Middle East for inspiration. And you see it in the title of the songs, Charlie Parker, A Night in Tunisia. There was a kind of fantasy about there was a kind of fantasy about the Middle East. There was a kind of fantasy about the Islamic world, which had to do with black musicians in the States in the 1970s. So all of these things, all of that diversity and variety, that sense of a world of music that I was busy exploring as an undergraduate. Within it, in retrospect, one can see various things that were just pushing me in the particular direction in which I eventually stepped.
Yeah. Then going in the timeline after the grad school, I think we went into the grad school then, right? Oxford.
Yes. So I did a PhD. I had to switch departments because the music department wasn't happy with the idea of me studying. I wouldn't say it was unhappy, but I would say they felt that they couldn't properly train me and educate me in what was then being referred to as non-Western music. Non-Western music is a pretty stupid idea, as though, all non-Western music is sort of fundamentally the same at some level or another. But the idea was, we don't really do that. Of course they do now, but then they didn't. And I remember Dennis Arnold, who was the professor of music there. I'd done quite well in my exams, and I'd made clear my ambitions to go on and do a PhD. And he took me aside and he said, "I very much appreciate and support the work that you're doing, Martin, but don't do it here. go and do it in another department." So I was very lucky in a way. I bumped into a couple of people. One of the great things about Oxford is its college life. And because of the college that I was in, I was introduced to anthropologists and to Middle East historians, and all of them were saying, "Look, it's obviously, this is something you're interested in, and the kind of interest that you've got could obviously make some kind of postgraduate study of some kind or another. We don't know exactly what that is, but come to us, right?" So I got these kind of warmly encouraging signals from various different directions, but the most encouraging, I think, was from the anthropology department in Oxford. And so I made that step. I applied for the grants and the bursaries and the scholarships. I was lucky enough to get them, and that door opened for me. I consider myself very lucky. I had some great supervisors there who loved music but weren't really kind of academic musicologists. But
Mm-hmm.
they knew a lot about anthropology, they knew a lot about Middle Eastern history, and they just kind of kept on pushing me, I think, in all of the right ways, even while allowing me to kind of make my own decisions about sort of how to do things and how to put things together.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote up a PhD on a kind of let's just call it a popular music in Turkey. You could call it a folk music as well, called arabesque.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting at the time because it was considered to be this music that was sort of influenced by Arab sounds, by Egyptian media and Egyptian films. The Turkish nationalists absolutely hated it. They thought this music was terrible. They thought this music was somehow betraying modern Turkey's desire to be a Western progressive nation.
Mm-hmm.
They associated it with the uneducated kind of lumpen proletariat. They despised this music. And the state did everything it could to keep this music at bay in a very ambiguous kind of way. So let's just say a kind of debate, a kind of cultural struggle kind of grew around this music, which had, at this particular moment, some very interesting kind of musical manifestations, I suppose you could say. You know, what was actually happening, not just around the music, but in the music, just struck me as being very interesting. And it was a world that, despite all of the difficulties of living in Istanbul during those years, it was a world that, you know, people were friendly and very hospitable to the idea of me kind of studying this and writing this PhD. So the PhD took the shape that it did, and then the PhD eventually became my first book. So that was what eventually came out of the postgraduate years, I suppose you could say, was a PhD thesis on Turkish
Yeah, I think,
arabesque.
yeah, we'll have a dedicated interview for that, I think. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot to say about, particularly
Yes.
about Turkey in the 1980s, which was a very complicated
Yeah.
place, and of course very, very different to what it is today in all sorts of ways.
I think we
But
should touch onto the master's time. What did you do in the master's?
well, so the masters was about halfway through that process. So my master's degree was a process of me changing from a kind of musicologist to a kind of anthropologist, because I
Okay.
decided that I was going to do my PhD in an anthropology department. So they made me do a master's degree in anthropology. This actually turned out to be significant because it gave me a kind of a qualification to teach anthropology
Mm-hmm.
uh, as well as music. And what happened when I graduated in 1989 was my PhD was in anthropology, and so I had become a kind of anthropologist of music. But as you can imagine, there aren't many opportunities, there aren't many places where teaching on and about music in an anthropology department was being practiced. To be honest, I didn't think that things were so tough in the UK at the moment. The universities were under such pressure from Margaret Thatcher's government. There were so many cuts, there were so many setbacks. At that point, I thought I wasn't going to get an academic job, and I was making plans to do other things. And once again, I had a very, very lucky break, which was, of course, a tragedy and a sadness for other people, but a very distinguished anthropologist of music called John Blacking contracted cancer and passed away very, very quickly. So quickly, in fact, that the entire university department that he had created was in a state of shock and just didn't really know what to do. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I was offered a job for a year at this place, and the year's job became a 2-year job, and at the end of 2 years, they decided to give me a lectureship. So it was this university's misfortune, the unfortunate fact of this very inspired man, John Blacking, passing away, that gave me this opportunity to get my first academic job. Had that not happened, I suspect that it would have been. I wonder how else my academic career might have started. But life is chance.
That's life.
Life is complete chance. In fact, so the job was in Belfast, and this is So the significance of that, I think, had to do with the fact that the Troubles, what we call the Troubles, were still going on in Northern Ireland at that moment, and it was actually the case that most people then, not now, but most people then would think twice about taking a job there. For me, it was an easy step to take. In fact, it was quite attractive because I have the father's side of my family is from there, and I felt kind of quite connected to that part of the world, and I was ready, very ready, to go and check it out. But that was one thing. I can also remember going for my interview, and I turned up late for my interview because what I didn't realise was that this thing called Belfast International Airport, I just assumed that it had to be somewhere near Belfast, but actually it turned out to be really quite a long way away. And getting anywhere in Northern Ireland in those days, you had to double the amount of time that you would expect because of the roadblocks and the police and the army and everything like that. And I was sitting next to some lovely people in the plane, and so we got talking, and they said, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to a job interview at Queen's University Belfast. And they said, when is it? And I told them when it was, 2:00 in the afternoon or 3:00 or whatever it was. And they talked amongst themselves for a little while and then leaned over. And I remember the guy, he just said, you're not going to make it. You're not going to get there. And I said, what? I was sitting on the plane. This is like, I could see this was going to be very important for me, getting this job. And he said, I'll tell you what. He said, don't worry, we'll drive you there. So we got off the plane. He said, if you're going to wait for a bus, he says, you're never going to get there. You're going to miss the interview by at least an hour. You've already missed it. But he said, look, don't worry, we'll drive you there. Complete strangers. So I got in the car and they dropped me at the door, and I turned up and I was about 10 minutes late for the interview. Wow. Which is not to be advised if you're serious about getting a job. But of course the interview went very well. There were very, very few anthropologists of music, people interested in music who could teach anthropology. I suspect on reflection, I was maybe the only candidate that they shortlist. So I got to the end of the interview thinking, well, I turned up 15 minutes late. That was insulting. That was it. Forget it. And at the end, they just said, when can you start? So first of all, I was extremely lucky to that particular circumstance happened in the way that it did. And secondly, the fact that two complete strangers took pity on me and drove me to my job interview, which I would have completely missed otherwise, was, I think, a matter of pure chance. But it did tell me something very powerful about just the extreme generosity and hospitality and friendliness of people in that part of the world, which became my life, actually, for the next 8 years. It's all chance, as you say, complete chance.
So you stayed there for how long, Martin?
I was there for 8 years, and I really had an opportunity to build up a kind of style of teaching, I suppose you could say, if that's not too grand a word to use, that I could more or less make up as I went along. I was more or less completely unsupervised. I had a whole area of the curriculum to look after myself. I was very young to have that job. I think I was 29. I wasn't even 30 at that point. And I could make things up as I went along. And in many ways, that I realize now how lucky I was to be in that situation. In these days, if you want to create a curriculum, you have to run it past 1 million committees. quite rightly. In those days, I didn't. I could basically wake up in the morning, decide what I was going to teach, how I was going to teach it, and then just crack on and teach it in that way. And again, I consider that a piece of enormous good fortune. For 8 years, eventually I was joined by some colleagues because things ended up going quite well, and the university decided to back me up a little bit and appoint some other people teaching the anthropology of music. But for quite a long time, I was just in this lovely position to be able to really kind of make things up as I went along myself. Mm-hmm. So those were very, for me, they were lovely years and formative years, and years in which I could experiment with what I thought about music, the music that I was doing, how I wanted to teach music, how I saw the connections between music and anthropology. Mm-hmm. And here's another thing about those years is that it connected me with Ireland, which was important for family reasons and kind of emotional reasons, I suppose you could say, as well. Mm-hmm. The folk music culture, the traditional music culture was just so alive in the northern part of Ireland in those years. Every evening you could go out, you could hear live music, you could hear bands. It was the one area of cultural life that wasn't infected by the struggle, by the Troubles, by this sort of low-grade civil war that we had. It was an area in which people could meet on very kind of equal and friendly grounds. Mm-hmm. It wasn't always straightforward. There were a lot of complications, and there were, of course, there were some exceptions to that. But the life of music of folk music and what they call traditional music in the northern part of Ireland in those days, I think, was something very remarkable. I was taken under the wing of some very good people, mm-hmm. whose kind of kindness to me, I think, in this regard, I still remember with immense gratitude and affection. And they just took me everywhere that I needed to go to meet the best musicians, hear the best music, and really just become part of that musical world. Mm-hmm. Not always easy if you are somebody like myself with an English accent, at a time in which there were just, really a lot of problems. You had to go with somebody who was a friend of a friend of a friend kind of thing, and you couldn't just turn up at these things. Mm-hmm. So for me, that taught me something about music. That taught me something about the value and the importance of music, particularly in situations of political stress or conflict. I think I learned a lesson from that. Mm-hmm. And it connected me, with a kind of folk traditional music practice that I'd long admired, as it were, from a bit of a distance in mm-hmm. England. Here's the thing, if you're interested in folk music in England, at least in those days, and still to a large extent, you would look up to Irish music. Irish music was, the real substance. It was the thing itself. So I had this, for me, that was very exciting, I think, just to be in that kind of milieu, in that kind of environment.
Interesting.
So, yes, those years were, again, I consider myself very, being there was the work of pure chance, but they were very important, I think.
Yeah.
Musically as well as intellectually as well.
And the results of your own freedom of teaching for sure has been materialized, and you have seen that reflecting on your students and their work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cliche, I know, to say that your students teach you. It's a kind of pious cliche to say that your students teach you, but they really did, actually. And here was the thing: I was a 29-year-old university lecturer or university professor, and most of my graduate students and even my master's students were older than me. They were people just much more experienced in life and thinking than I was. Again, I can remember them all and I could recite a list of names here of people from whom I really did learn important lessons, not just about life, but about music.
Mm.
So to be in the rather sort of complicated situation of being their quote unquote teacher, it did put things on a good footing, I would have said, for me.
Mm.
I think it taught me never to always understand teaching as a two-way exchange of knowledge and information and understanding.
Mm.
I think it's made me, beyond the conventional pieties, I think peculiarly committed to the idea of the relationship between teacher and student as a relationship of equals.
Mm.
I've always understood my job as a teacher not to tell people things that they don't know, but rather to model a process of learning, right? To model a process of conversation.
Interesting.
Because that is what knowledge is. Knowledge comes out of dialogue. It comes out of conversation. And I think from a very early stage, I think teaching these rather wonderful, musically very mature and accomplished people, whatever it was that I thought that I knew, I think it did communicate to me that, I'm never going to have, as it were, stuff to tell them, but over the course of time, what the skill that I could develop or that I could aspire to was one of just modeling this process of learning, of inquiring, of finding out about the world of music. And so I think in many ways it was the best possible start that I could have had.
Mm-hmm. So that was which year now? After the 8 years?
I went there in '89, the winter of 1989, which was the winter that John Blacking passed away, and I stayed there until 1997. So it was an 8 year period, a period in which we didn't. My kids were born there, which turns out to be important because it now qualifies them for an Irish passport. With Brexit, that turns out to be quite significant. So in many ways, all the big important kind of steps of adult life started there. It was a very important period for me, but it was a period, unfortunately, in which we didn't see the end of the conflict that came later. So I still remember, as it were, the end of those troubled years.
Then what happened next?
I went to America. I went to Chicago. It was a big upheaval in a way from a family point of view, but the kids were still young enough, and my wife, bless her, was prepared to travel. And so for people interested in the anthropology of music, or people interested in ethnomusicology, as it's called, America was the first to, I suppose, develop this field of study. And I always felt that a part of my education required me to go to the States and just have this experience. I found myself sitting on a couple of, actually 3 job offers. I don't quite know how that happened. But I decided on, and I'm not even quite sure why, but I decided that Chicago was where I wanted to be, and I accepted that job offer, and off we went. The big change for me was not just moving to a different country and a different continent and a different culture and the other side of the world, and but it was also moving from an anthropology department to a music department, which I thought would be easy, but in many ways it wasn't. And in many ways I still feel as though that transformation, that sort of institutional transformation, is still a little incomplete.
Hmm.
But I went there, and they offered me a tenured job, because at that point I'd been teaching for 8 years. So it was a very good offer. It was a very generous offer. They seemed to be prepared to take a risk on me.
Hmm.
So of course, what could I do but take a risk on them? And I went to Chicago.
So what was it? How many years in Chicago?
I spent 10 years. I spent 10 years in Chicago. So again, to think of this in terms of my lifespan, by the time that I got to the end of that, I was looking at something like a quarter of my entire life had been spent in Chicago. My kids had become teenagers there. They'd swapped their Northern Irish Belfast accents for Midwestern American accents. They'd become little American children with perfect American teeth. In many ways, I never acquired an American accent, but I suppose in many ways I became quite Americanized, and probably at the end of that 10 years, I reckoned that I was going to stay there. But it involved switching to a music department. It involved being a long way away from Turkey and Istanbul. So all the while, even that I'd been in Belfast, it was an easy matter to get to Istanbul. It was an easy matter to continue my research. It was an easy matter to get to London, where there's very big Turkish and Kurdish communities. It was very easy to kind of maintain my Turkish music interests and connection. But the moment I moved to Chicago, that changed. It was a long way away. It was expensive to get there. It involved a lot of travel. There was no big Turkish and Turkish-speaking community in Chicago. It certainly had a big Arab community, which is another story. But the Turkish community was kind of quite small. It was rather restricted to kind of university professors who didn't want to talk about anything as boring and tedious as Turkish music. They were very the people I can think of were very cosmopolitan people and very cosmopolitan characters. For me, what was important looking back was that it meant a break with all of the work on Turkey that I'd been doing. My PhD had been written. I'd turned it into a book. I'd written a handful of articles, and so I'd reached a moment when I could kind of reinvent myself a little bit. It was a kind of what next sort of moment. So various things happened in the American years. I think one had to do with what grew out of my interest in arabesque. So arabesque, you remember, supposedly a music influenced by Egyptian film music, supposedly. But nobody really knew anything about that. I found myself thinking, well, what if it is? Shouldn't I find out something about Egyptian film music? Shouldn't I find out something about the world of Arab music in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s that was supposedly influencing this Turkish popular music? It seemed like an obvious kind of step. Should I not spend some time in Egypt, and just try and find out about this Cairo, this city, find out something about this music and culture. I mean, it was beginning to occur to me that this was an obvious next step. Pretty early in my time in Chicago, I bumped into a Palestinian composer and oud player called Issa Boulos. Maybe you know him, or maybe some of our listeners will know him. But we became good friends, and he was an inspiration, a real inspiration as a musician, as a kind of creative being, as an instrumentalist, as a composer. And as somebody, and as a pedagogue as well. He was a natural kind of teacher, and already then he had a kind of circle of non-Arab people around him who he was teaching oud to and was just sort of bringing into his world. He had a very good ensemble. He had two things going on. One was an ensemble that he used to call Radio Maqam.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that he did, I can't remember exactly whether he was the director or what his role was in it, but he was heavily involved in something called the Chicago Immigrant Orchestra, which is still going strong.
Mm.
So Isa inspired me a lot, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that, and the other thing was that the university had a very strong tradition of studying the modern Middle East, as well as the ancient Middle East as well. It had a very big Middle East studies department. There were some wonderful professors of Arabic, Ottoman, and Persian literature. Some very distinguished individuals. There were some very big and significant names in the study of Islam. Michael Sells, for example, was there. He became a very important figure in the aftermath of the so-called the 9/11 episode in American public life. Rashid Khalidi was there, and various people who, in various ways, became friends, mentors, and somehow or another, I found myself learning Arabic. Because this just seemed to be an obvious thing to do. If I wanted a window onto the musical culture, it seemed to me that I couldn't do this without at least having an ability to read and passively understand Arabic. So I had some wonderful teachers, including Farooq Abdul Wahab Mustafa, who was a very distinguished translator of he's passed away, sadly. He was a very distinguished translator of Egyptian literature, and a man whose teaching method used to consist of telling long, rambling, and very funny stories in Arabic, and they were so interesting and so funny. You wanted to learn the language to understand the point of his funny stories. So I was lucky to have this great experience of people who weren't just teaching me Arabic, but were introducing me to Egyptian literature. I mean, one of the first things that Farooq Mustafa would do would be to put Ihsan Abdul Qudus stories in front of you. Right, way too difficult for a beginner. But he would make you. His way of learning literature was to insist. Sorry, his way of teaching you language was to insist that this is about culture. Without having a kind of passion for the culture or a desire to learn something about the culture, the literary culture, the historic, the culture writ large.
Yeah.
That was what was required in his mind to kind of drag you forward, learning the language. So yes, I'll never forget learning Arabic by reading Ihsan Abdul Qudus stories with Farooq Mustafa. Which became very significant, actually, when I started looking at Egyptian cinema and Egyptian film music in the 1950s, because Ihsan Abdul Qudus, provided a lot of the stories for the Abdul Halim films, and as you know.
Yeah.
So all of these things, I don't quite know how and why, but all of these things just started pulling me in those years in the direction of Cairo. I managed to get the funding to spend a month here, 2 months there, 3 months there. And over the course of those years, which were the beginning roundabout in the year 2000, for most of the next 10 years, I was visiting Cairo on a regular basis and learning about the city, learning about its culture, learning about its music, getting music lessons from some very good and very interesting people, learning the El-Ameya Masriya from some very good and inspired teachers, actually, poets. I mean, you know how things are in Egypt. Everybody is a poet. So, again, you're not just learning the language, you're just being brought into this very, very powerful cultural center of gravity, which is Cairo.
Yeah.
Which was Cairo even in the latter Mubarak years, which were not great, as we all know. But there's just the sense of a kind of a cultural universe just became very, very strong to me then. So this all led me in the direction of beginning some research on the musical culture of the 1940s and the 1950s, which seemed kind of quite relevant to Turkish arabesque, and just immersing myself in that musical world.
So that took you into learning instruments and
It took me into
a lot of
learning instruments.
research.
Yes. So in Turkey, I'd been. It was always important to me as an anthropologist. I suppose you could say it's a principle of how you learn and how you construct dialogue and how you construct conversation about what it is that you want to learn. But for me, an important part of the process was always learning musical instruments. So I would learn musical instruments not to become good at them. I've never had the talent or the skill necessarily, but as a means of learning how to listen, really. If you can play the oud, if you can play the kanun, if you can play other instruments, it's teaching you how to listen. You can hear the structures. And you can hear the structures because you can imagine what hands are doing, what arms are doing, what the body is doing. With a musical instrument in your hand, you're always in a position to ask questions. Why like this? Why not like that? Or why is this so difficult? Or why are things done this way rather than that way? So if you make that commitment to learning an instrument, to submitting yourself to that authority of a music teacher who's going to say, well, in order to do this, you need to learn that. In order to learn that, you need to do these exercises, these drills. This listening.
Yeah.
Has always been a very important part, I suppose you could say, of my process. Well, that puts it in slightly grand terms. So this started, I think, in Turkey, where over the course of the 10 years that I was just describing, I learnt the instrument that is really central to vernacular Turkish music, folk music, popular music, which is an instrument called the saz, or the bağlama. It's a long-necked lute. It's a little bit like the bozuk, I suppose, in the world. It's fretted so that you can play the koma notes and play makam on it in a certain kind of way. And it's a folk music instrument. It's got some significance for the Alevi in Turkey, as you perhaps know. So it's an important instrument. And though I never developed any great skills on it, learning that instrument was a very important way, not just for me to apprehend arabesque and listen to arabesque and understand how it was put together, but to be able to talk to the people who compose the songs. Because, if you're asking somebody a question, how do you compose? Where does your inspiration come from? If you ask a composer, how did this song come into being? 9 times out of 10, they won't know how to really answer that question. Or if they give you an answer to that question, it's a kind of mystified, sort of poetic sort of answer. But if you can say, look, this bit seems to work on the saz in this particular way. You are in Makam Hijaz, or you're in Makam Ushak, or you're in, Makam Rast, or whatever it is here. And then you have this bit where you're suddenly in Nihawand, shall we say. And all of a sudden I'm finding, that I'm having to move my fingers. There's a difference between this section, which is like this, and this section, which is like that. And I'm experiencing it in a particular way because I'm approaching it because I'm trying to play it on the saz. Then you've got a conversation, and you've got a meaningful conversation from a kind of musicological perspective.
Right.
You're actually going to learn something interesting and useful about the compositional process when you can talk about kind of material details like that. You see what I mean? So that's that's why the process of learning an instrument, finding an instrument, which is itself quite an interesting part of the process, and then finding a teacher, and then kind of submitting yourself to that authority and to that discipline. Which in some ways it does something, I think, to the. It's a difficult thing to talk about, but it does something to the very, as an English person going to do research in Cairo, you're always going to be part of the kind of colonial experience, the post-colonial experience. There is always going to be that problematic and difficult history which plays itself out, in 1,000,001 different ways. There is always going to be, for the worst possible reasons, there is always going to be this assumption that as this person who has come from England, you are somehow involved in reproducing that past. But the moment that you have decided that you're going to learn an instrument, and you've kind of inverted those sort of historical power relations, something different happens. Now, I'm not saying it's as easy as that. I'm not saying it's as simple as that. And I'm not saying that all you have to do is pick up a musical instrument and, 100 years of difficult and problematic and often brutal colonial rule is going to be somehow inverted. Of course, that's not the case. But it does put things, it puts you at an angle to that. I would have said, and that's another aspect of the process that I think has been important and been quite significant. Sorry, this is a rather long answer to your question, but that commitment started in Turkey. I picked up the bağlama. I got quite a long way on that, thanks to the kind of informal teaching that I got from my great friend there, Ibrahim Can. I also got lessons at a kind of bağlama school run by a guy called Yavuz Top. He was very good. I picked up the kanun because that seemed to be an interesting thing to do. I had a wonderful teacher called Tuncay Güresoy. He had a kanun made for me by a very talented but amateur kanun maker. I can't even remember his last name. We just knew him as Okkan Albay, Colonel Okkan. He was a very high-ranking officer in the Turkish army. He was an interesting man. So I got this kanun, and I spent a good year learning it with Mr. Tuncay Güresoy. Bless him. One year I had to go back to England and I couldn't take it with me in the plane, and I asked a friend to look after it. His friend should remain nameless, but he left it over the course of a cold Istanbul winter. He left it leaning against a radiator, and when I came back the next spring, it had completely destroyed it. So that was the end of the kanun, and in fact that turned out to be quite significant because I didn't pick the kanun up then for well over 10 years. A long time passed. In Chicago, so at this point I was gravitating towards the Arab world and to Egypt in particular. I had the very inspirational mentorship, I suppose you could say, of Asa Boulos at Chicago. He was working as a librarian at Chicago at the time, and he was trying to, create a musical life for himself there, which he did very successfully in the end. I attended Simon Shaheen, another very interesting Palestinian presence in American Arab music life. Simon Shaheen used to run a workshop in Mount Holyoke. He still does, in rural Massachusetts.
Is that
for a couple of years I went there, and at that point, that was the retreat, the famous retreat. Again, Simon was very, very good at reaching out to non-Arabs who were interested in Arab music, giving them a model really of how they could learn this music, what they needed to do, a model really of how you could put together ensembles. And I think that this was what was very interesting. So people went to that retreat And then, like me and many other people, they went back from the retreat, they went back to their home colleges or universities or schools and started their own little kind of groups,
Mm.
very much on the Simon Shaheen kind of model.
Mm.
So that had an effect on me. I was playing oud at that point, or I was trying to play oud at
Mm-hmm.
that point.
Mm.
What I did notice at the retreat was that there would be 40, young white kids like myself who had all picked up the oud because they could play guitar and they thought this is the instrument that you play.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever we got together to play as an orchestra, there would be a small percussion section. There would be 2 or 3 people playing the violin, and there would be about 40 ouds.
Wow.
An absolutely enormous number. And that was the point at which I noticed, a qanun would be, where are the qanun players? And that was the point at which I started to look around and think, well, there seems to be a bit of a problem here. So at the retreat, Georges Sawa,
Uh-huh.
wonderful, wonderful scholar and musician. He used to do all of the qanun playing. If he wasn't playing qanun, there was no qanun sound there at all. So it must have been at that point that I was thinking, well, maybe I should get back to the qanun and make myself a bit useful. So that was what I did.
So this is at the music level from a practice point. Uh, but I'm sure you were busy in the academia with some kind of research questions, which is the connection with the Arabesque and maybe beyond, because these are 10 years, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
So, what the first thing I discovered was that though it's very interesting comparing Turkey and Egypt, actually. And it's very interesting experiencing Egypt with Turkish eyes, or with kind of half Turkish eyes, because I still feel, I hope I'll be forgiven for saying this, but I still feel that Cairo feels to me a very Ottoman city in many ways. It has an Ottoman infrastructure to it. I feel the Ottoman city very close to the surface. There are many other cities in Cairo, of course.
Yeah.
There's the Mamluk city and of course ancient cities as well. But the Ottoman city has always been very present to me, and so it was an interesting experience for me, kind of taking my Turkish experience and my expectations about Turkish and Ottoman music with me to Cairo. It's always meant that I've seen it in a rather particular kind of way. It's always meant that I've heard it in a rather particular kind of way, which means that sometimes my expectations are satisfied and sometimes they are, disrupted. It's really not the same at all. It really is kind of quite different. So I think what I discovered in this process is that actually making that switch from trying to be a scholar of Turkish music to trying to be a scholar of Arabic music was surprisingly difficult, actually. It was surprisingly difficult. I wasn't going to be able to move as quickly, to think as quickly. There was so much background that I needed. There was just sort of so many things to struggle with. I focused on film music because the film music seemed to me to be significant to how Egyptian music traveled around the region. And it didn't just travel around the Arab world. It didn't just travel around Turkey. It traveled to Greece. It traveled all around the Mediterranean world. It traveled to China. Egyptian film music is globally a very, very significant and interesting phenomenon. So I started to think about that, and it meant that I was thinking not just about music, but about film and about cinema. So I started working with and thinking through these problems with scholars of film, and particularly, I have to use the word non-Western film. Again, at Chicago, there were some very, very good people I found to talk to about this. And it led me in the direction of a handful of articles on and chapters that I've written in books about Abdul Halim Hafiz, who I still remain interested in. None of this has taken the shape and form of a book, but So in other words, it didn't immediately produce academic fruit, I suppose, in a conventional sense. But far more importantly, far more significantly, I think it planted questions and interests and kind of an affection for Egyptian culture, which continues to kind of, keep pushing me forward. I mean, the other thing to say about life as an academic, and it's easy, of course, for people who are not academics to imagine the delights of a world in which you can find something that really deeply interests you and you can spend your waking life doing that. I mean, of course, as any academic knows who is listening to this podcast, that actually 90% of your time, well, I would have said 45% of your time is spent teaching and dealing with everything that revolves around teaching. 45% of your time is spent as a kind of an administrator in a large organization, which is fundamentally the same these days. If you're working in I don't know, a bank or a brewery or a thing like that. I mean, just, living in a big institution and dealing with administrative life is just always going to be part of the story. I finished up my time in Chicago as director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, which sounds like a very exalted position, but in fact it wasn't at all. It was typically kind of mid-career people who would take on these jobs, which were just kind of heavy-duty administrative jobs. We had to apply for a lot of grants to keep the center running, and that was what my life actually consisted of for my last 3 years at Chicago, which was great actually, because being the director of the center meant that we had a wonderful common room in the center called the Fazlur Rahman Common Room, after the Pakistani architect who had designed Sears Tower, still the tallest building in the world at that point. So it was called the Fazlur Rahman Common Room. And whenever we were not doing our proper work, you would sit there and I would have the most fantastic conversations with the great historians of the Ottoman world, the great poets, the great literary figures, their visitors. So that was a wonderful education, I would have said, in and of itself, even as I was doing this otherwise rather dull administrative job.
Then you decided to come back to the UK.
So then I decided to come back to the UK. Oh, just one last thing I'll say about that, and just going back to Issa Boulos, and I do want to pay a bit of tribute to him, is that together we formed something that we called the Middle East Music Ensemble there, and this started off as a very amateur kind of production. In fact, we used to meet in my kitchen in Greenwood Avenue in Hyde Park. And then I managed to get a bit of money to put this on a properly funded thing and get a kind of a half position. And eventually we had a number of directors, and then eventually Issa became the director of this ensemble, and it really turned a corner with him. And it went from being a rather amateur thing to being a very sophisticated performance machine that involved members of the Arab community, the Persian community, which was big in Chicago, and the Turkish community. We would put on annual conferences that would pack out whatever concert hall we booked. It would be full. And it suddenly turned into kind of quite a professional thing. And just as I was leaving, we did things like we headlined the Chicago World Music Festival. And we performed on the Garrison Keillor show. I don't know whether anybody remembers the Garrison Keillor show. When he came to Chicago, we were the people to ask. So I had the very interesting experience of going from 0 to 60 in a very, very short period of time. And this had a tremendous amount to do with Issa's kind of skills as an organizer and his charisma and his sort of ability to teach. But I tell you another thing about that period, which is definitely part of the story, and that was 9/11.
Mm.
So the anxieties and the fears that had built up around Arab culture after that, and of course the Iraq invasion and occupation as
Yeah.
well, were extreme. Like, I cannot communicate just how difficult, how tense, how politicized, how anxious, and how difficult
Mm.
any discussion of Arab culture became in those years in America.
Mm.
This bears a little bit on why I wanted to come back to the UK,
Mm-hmm.
actually,
Mm-hmm.
where for all of our problems, that conversation at least is possible.
Mm.
In the UK, for all of our problems, at least we can sit down and have a halfway sensible conversation about Israel-Palestine, for
Mm-hmm.
example.
Mm-hmm.
Not so in America. You just could not have that conversation in America. There were so many things that you just could not speak about. There
Mm-hmm.
were so many things that were off limit. And this was something I learned very quickly as director of the centre. I wanted to do this, I wanted to do that, but no, you just can't do it. This would get picked up by the press. It would get reported in the wrong way. The donor culture would suffer, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found with music was that this was where people could meet. This was where people could park their politics. And again, I'm saying this not in a naive sense, but people felt able around music just to say, okay, it doesn't matter who I am or where I'm from. We're going to find something to share in this music. This, let's just say, Makan music.
Yeah.
We're going to trust Isa, because he was a very dependable person in this regard, to kind of pull things together in a particular way. And this is going to be our commitment. This is going to be our statement. This is going to be our model about how we can kind of pursue a serious interest in culture in this country and make it a public thing, which is what that ensemble did, and do it with some kind of not just to score kind of diversity points or something like that, but to do it in a way that had some real musical integrity about it. We played with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, for example. We did some kind of really kind of quite prominent and quite interesting things. So when I look back to my time in America, I think all sorts of things didn't work out, and all sorts of things didn't produce the kind of in some kind of conventional academic sense, it didn't produce the kinds of things that I was hoping and expecting that it might. But that, I think, was a real success, and something I remember very, very fondly. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of why I came back to the UK. I think one being, the kind of suffocating atmosphere of the politics, the suffocating atmosphere of just any kind of involvement in Arab culture, what you could say, what you couldn't say, what was allowed, what wasn't allowed, what was off bounds, and the feeling that, of course, that the government, the Bush government, was just utterly corrupt, and it was a kind of gangsters were in charge, who were out for themselves. And as an English person, you don't have a vote. I wasn't going to get my citizenship, and you just felt. It didn't feel good at all. It didn't feel good. So this had something to do, I think, it was one of the things I think that had to do with my desire to come back to the UK. Of course, there were family things were involved. Another thing I think was a swerve back in the direction of Turkey. Another book had been building up in the meantime, and I wanted to finish that book, and I renewed my connection with Boğaziçi University, where I had a kind of visiting position in the sociology department there, and that produced the second book that I wrote about Turkish music, called The Republic of Love, which just came out of that moment. And it, again, I think the desire to be back and to renew my connections with Istanbul, intellectually and culturally, and just to be in a part of the world where it was always going to be easy for me just to get to Istanbul and to live in a city which had got a big kind of Turkish community and Turkish and Kurdish community. That was a big part of the decision.
So after Chicago, which university you were going to?
Well, so I spent 5 years in Oxford. I went back to Oxford. So Oxford remember, has the power and the finances to be able to buy people out of their comfortable American jobs, and which is not to make it sound like too mercenary a decision, but it just had to be possible to come back without completely bankrupting myself. But bless them, they did. They gave me a position, and a college position as well as a university position, and I did that for 5 years, which was great. I had done 5 happy years in Oxford. What was crucial about that period of time was bumping into a bunch of musicians there. Tariq Bashir, who has been on your podcast, of course, Yara Salahuddin, Ahmed Selhi. Again, I'm sure that some of your podcast listeners will be very familiar with these names.
Yeah.
These people became, we were still young. we're still young, of course, but we were even younger then, and I don't think we really knew what we were interested in, but some kind of interest in the earlier classical music of the Arab world and the Ottoman world was taking shape. Some kind of desire to connect, thinking and researching about this music with performing it and playing it. Some kind of desire to make something happen in Oxford, which is a strangely provincial little place, actually. Something to do with, I think, friendships that just kind of started and blossomed then. Through the medium, actually, of a Turkish friend of ours, Gökhan Yücel, and somewhere on the other side of this podcast, I'll send him a copy of this, because I would like him to know, actually, just how influential he was in kind of pulling a bunch of people together. Very thoughtful, interesting, rather charismatic guy, actually.
Yeah.
And then he went back to Turkey. So that was the beginning of our little ensemble, which we call Oxford Makam.
Yes.
Which has been really kind of important to me, actually. Again, I think we've achieved the odd interesting thing. I think we've achieved the odd complete misfire as well. But more than anything, I think it's just a model of how people can gather around music, can gather around a kind of a musical project, and do interesting things, I think, with actually very kind of minimal resources, other than a desire to do those interesting things. So Oxford was crucial, I think, in that happening and that starting. In the UK, we tend to move around, I think, from academic job to academic job. And when a nice offer came up from King's College in London 5 years later, I decided to move because I was spending so much of my life in London. It just started to seem to make sense to live and work there. A typical Oxford Makam evening, or a typical evening in my life when I was in Oxford, would involve me being out at some event or some gig, or in some cafe there. We go around to somebody's place afterwards. We do play a little bit more music, and then all of a sudden it's 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, and I've got a meeting at 9 o'clock or at 10 o'clock, or a lecture at 9 o'clock or at 10 o'clock. And so I'd be sitting on that cold and dark bus that would take you back from Hyde Park to Oxford, the famous Oxford Tube. It would take you about 2 hours. So you're crawling into bed at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and we all know what this feels like. You're crawling into bed at 5 o'clock in the morning with buzzing with all of the music and the conversation and all of the cups of sweet tea that you've been drinking.
Yeah.
And then you somehow got to start the next day in a few hours' time. I just thought, so much is just pulling me back. It's pulling me towards London. I've got it the wrong way around. I should be living in London. I should be working in London. I should be visiting my friends in Oxford and then coming back to London. So the job came up at King's, and it was very, it was a good offer. I was very enthusiastic about it. Very good music department, exciting place right in the middle of London. So that was the next step for me, and I've been happily ever after. I've been there ever since.
So that was which year? 2010 plus five.
Gosh, no,
Yeah.
that would be. So I came back from Chicago in 2007. 5 years later would be 2012. 2012 to the present day has been King's College, London.
So what are the activities and the research since then?
Well, that coincided with me publishing The Republic of Love that came out in those years.
Yeah.
So whenever you write a book, there's a process that kind of comes out of it, which is it gets reviewed. Sometimes it gets reviewed positively, sometimes it gets reviewed negatively. Typically, it's a little bit of a mixture of the two. On this occasion, I think the reviews were very favourable, but that sets in motion a conversation with people who otherwise you didn't know, and they invite you to do things and participate in conversations and discussions. So there was that. The book was translated into Turkish, and that process took a whole year. I worked with a wonderful translator called Hira Doru, a very, very, very intellectual and very thoughtful person who I think now has a career in kind of eco farming. He's not your typical metropolitan intellectual. But at one point we were exchanging emails daily about translating my ideas, which I built up in Turkey, as it were, back into Turkish. So, here's an interesting thing. The book is called The Republic of Love. In Turkish, you have two words for love. You have aşk, a word that you'll be familiar with, and you have sevgi.
Aşk,
and sevgi. So how are we going to translate the title? Is it aşk or is it sevgi?
Yeah.
Now, that's already an interesting question. But I was very interested in that book in how various musical icons were turned into, as it were, kind of figures of exemplary citizenship. How and why these musicians, people are looking at these musicians and listening to them and just using this word, describing them as some, kind of model citizens. When they write the biographies of these characters, this word citizenship kind of keeps on coming up. But here's another problem. Again, in Turkish, you've got two words for citizenship. You've got vatandaş, from vatan, which and yurttaş, as in yurt, just meaning like home, as in a yurt. Yurttaş. So again, like the arguments that I was trying to build, the points that I was trying to make, translating these back into the Turkish environment to make a text out of this, in Turkish involved confronting some questions that I'd never really thought about, actually. Is it aşk? Is it aşk or is it sevgi? Is it vatandaş or is it yurttaş? And so on and so forth. This goes, every step of the way. This has to do with the Turkish language. You've got this choice. Am I going to choose like a quote-unquote pure Turkish word, or am I going to choose, as it were, the Arabic word that everybody actually uses, like aşk?
Yes.
Or watan,
Yes.
And so you go to your Turkish friends, and who are all scholarly and intelligent people, and you say, "What's the answer to this?" And they'll say, "I'll tell you what the answer is." And then you ask another one because you want to check up, and they'll give you completely the opposite answer. Okay, this is as it is, and this is as it should be. But this is a process.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, I've been living with. I've been over the last 10 years. I've been that process has been ongoing. And I'm currently writing a book about the musical citizen, in which I find myself thinking about this. So one thing leads to another, I suppose, is at this stage of life, I think the ideas start to have a little bit of organicism about them. I don't wake up in the morning and decide I'm going to work on a new project. it's a case now of just following the lines of implication that come out of things I've always been interested in.
Yeah, it builds up.
It builds up. That's right, and the questions become. I think and I believe they become deeper questions. They become more serious questions, and they become kind of more general questions. I suppose you could say as well.
Yes. Uh, I think we will have dedicated episodes for discussing these ideas and the PhD subjects, the big questions you have already raised and attempted to answer, and of very valuable impact, really, in the literature.
Well, that's kind of you. Kind of
Mm,
you. That's kind of you. That's kind of you to say so.
mm,
I experience things, as it were, from within very, very differently. I don't know how my work circulates. I don't really know how it gets read. Every now and again, I read a review of it.
mhm,
To tell the truth, I don't think about it very much.
mhm,
But what I do think about is the interactions that I have with my graduate students,
mhm,
my postdoctoral students, and my close musician friends.
mhm,
That for me is where, in a sense, the real work
mhm,
um, takes place. That's where, to the extent that I have a sense of mission or duty. These are slightly
mhm,
grand terms. But that's where it is.
mhm. Yeah, I think in the timeline we have reflected on many things of what I will say now, but feel free to comment on any of these, please.
Gosh,
Yeah,
you've been so generous in giving me um, a lot of space. Um,
we are
a lot,
delighted to have you here.
you've given me, as they say, a lot of rope to hang myself. You know that English expression.
Yeah.
And no doubt, I've done that.
Mhm. I really
I
enjoyed the discussion.
Well, thank you,
Yeah. Mm.
thank you, thank you. You'll have heard from. Well, it's been interesting for me to be involved in this process of yours because I loved the podcast with Ross
Mhm.
Daly. That was very interesting. So Ross Daly is like a kind of has an almost like sort of godlike status in my
Mm.
in my existence at,
Mm.
at a very early age. I think looking back to what it looked like, what it felt like in the 1980s.
Mm.
What the model was, I suppose you could say, of the
Mm.
world musician.
Yeah.
What you could, in the days before everything was on your computer digitally.
Yes.
When you actually had to sort of go out and try and kind of locate
Mhm.
world music, the music of the non-West. It didn't just come to you.
Yes.
It took actually a big effort of will to kind of to take that step, to do that reaching out, to kind of
Mhm.
pursue that line of inquiry. Um, and not many people were doing it. But Ross Daly was a very early stage. I remember being conscious of him
Mhm.
as, well, this is what you can do.
Mhm.
This is a model for this. Of course, a
Mhm.
very inspired model, a very influential model.
Mhm.
Um, he was of that generation, I suppose. Another great hero of mine was John Bailey and his wife Veronica Doubleday,
Mm.
um, who also kind of came out of the sort of environment that I understand Ross Daly himself came out of, and devoted themselves to performance, and became very deeply connected and entangled with Afghan
Mm.
music before all of the disasters that
Mhm.
sort of fell on Afghanistan after the following the Soviet invasion.
Mm.
But these people, I think were very interesting and very significant, and because it was a model not just of, of scholarship, it was a model not just of knowing the music and understanding maqam and understanding the history of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just a model of performing as well. It wasn't just, I'm going to learn these instruments and I'm going to learn to play them extremely well. But it was a model of, I'm going to use that word again, a certain kind of global citizenship. It was a model of, this is what I could do. Given that I know this, given that I've learned this, given that I have these kinds of energies and skills and, have this kind of musical wisdom, I suppose you could say, this is what I'm going to do with it. This is how I could make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Ross Daly has always been very, very inspiring, actually. So it was very, very nice. I found his podcast with you just extremely interesting. Actually.
Yeah, interesting. This one too. This episode is so inspiring to me, really. And you already reflected on travel experiences, the places you have seen, the time at those sections you have highlighted. You touched on people, music, ensembles, activities, challenges, financial and cultural matters. If we rewind, where would you like to comment on the timeline for these aspects?
Well, it's been a life. It's not over yet. I've been lucky to have it. I'm struck at all of the. It's interesting that you asked me to break things down into the segments that you did, because when I think about these segments, and you've invited me to think about what these transitions were, they've all been hugely significant, I think, to me and to where I feel I am now. And every one of them rested on chance. Every one of them rested on circumstances that were just completely outside of my control. And speaking to you, I do realize just what a work of chance a life is. That's what struck me about speaking to you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's go into some of the subjects we already touched on.
Sure.
Just say some titles, and I like to hear some comments about them, or maybe some
Sure.
elaboration. And let's talk about the reinvention of self.
Well, I think I've just said something that is relevant to that, which is that it does come down to chance elements. You think of the reinvention of self as being an act of will, don't we?
Yes.
You wake up in the morning and you decide that you're going to be another kind of a self. Well, it doesn't happen like that, of course. Things happen to you,
yes,
just as much as you happen to other things. And reflecting on the path that I've taken, the things that what it was that took me to Belfast, what it was that took me into anthropology, what it was that took me to Morocco and then Turkey, what it was that took me to Belfast, what it was that took me to America, what it was that brought me back here. The major determining things were actually chance events.
chance and a decision, maybe a personal decision
And
and
a decision that
commitment.
follows. So, I people who know me know this very well, but I would possibly still be living in America had our house not caught fire and burnt down. We experienced that as a tragedy. It was a terrible trauma. Luckily that everybody was safe, but we lost most of our stuff. And I think that until the last minute, I was 50-50 as to whether I was going to come back to England. But that that pushed me over the edge. It's things like that that actually determine the passage of a life. So now I look back on, of course, I thought that it was a terrible thing to happen at the time, but now I look back on it actually as, the best thing that could have happened to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Intelligentsia.
So intelligentsia, yeah. So we're embarrassed about that word, aren't we? Intelligentsia in the United Kingdom, we've kind of professionalized intellectual life. So we're academics, I think, before we're intellectuals. we're academics before we're members of the intelligentsia. And in England, I think that we have, and particularly in the United States, I think in this regard, we're very different, by the way. The United Kingdom and the United States are very, very, very different intellectual cultures. Very different indeed. But I think what connects us is that we have a very professionalized idea about who's allowed to have opinions and ideas, right? Whereas in continental Europe, I think for all sorts of historical reasons, you have intellectual life outside the universities, outside the colleges. You have worlds of journalism, you have worlds of writing, you have the world of letters, which is not necessarily connected to the world of universities. And where it is appropriate to speak about public intellectuals, where it is appropriate to speak about the intelligentsia. I am a creature, obviously, of the academic world and a world of very professionalized intellectual production. And I think there's a loss there. Without wanting to kind of fantasize about, the idea that everything is better in continental Europe, I think that there is a loss. We lose something, I think, in our professionalized intellectual existence.
Interesting.
Of course, with my kind of vital connections, both with Turkey and Egypt, I'm also familiar with the world that, of course, your podcast addresses, which is the world of people who are doing the most deep thinking in their societies, who are not university professors, and in fact they couldn't do the thinking that they're doing, and they couldn't do the writing and the podcasting and the creating the music that they do if they were in universities. If they were in universities, all of this would be impossible. So again, there's a kind of another kind of construction here of intellectual life, which I've become very familiar with, and I have a lot of respect for.
Interesting. The cosmopolitan intellectual?
Well, the word cosmopolitan has become a complicated one. I think I wouldn't describe myself as a cosmopolitan intellectual. I don't feel that's right, because actually my experience of the world is in some ways limited. It's limited to North America, Northwestern Europe, and to the parts of the Arab world and Turkey that I know. There's nothing. It's cosmopolitan in the sense that this is not terribly usual in the United Kingdom. So when I'm talking about what I do to my fellow academics, they say, "Oh, that's interesting. Oh, you've seen a lot of things, But actually, I've just seen a very particular slice of things, and I don't think that adds up to cosmopolitanism. So I don't think I am a cosmopolitan intellectual. I'm not also sure that I necessarily aspire or want to be cosmopolitan in, I think, a rather conventional, let's say, kind of Kantian sense of cosmopolitanism here. I think that you can be rooted. I think that you can have roots. And I think that roots are important, but I think you can have multiple roots. So if I aspire to something, it is that kind of rootedness. I'm never going to suddenly decide that I'm interested in Brazil, or Southeast Asian culture. For me, this connection with both Arab culture and with Turkish culture is something that I want to have. I want to be rooted. Yeah.
Interesting. How would you approach the improvisation of music beyond the study of taqsim?
Well, that is a very interesting question. So first of all, it's a complicated question, and I'm not sure I can give you as simple an answer as I would like to give you. But here's just a couple of thoughts. One is that the teaching of maqam and taqsim improvisation, I think in the Arab world and certainly in Turkey, in the conservatory system there, has become rather weak, which is to say it's based around models, and one is expected to adhere to these models. So we've all had the experience, I'm sure, of listening to somebody playing a taksim in one concert, and then you hear them a few months later at another concert, and they play the same taksim note for note. Right? Just I've just heard it over and over and again. And I'm afraid I've heard this a lot in Egypt. I've definitely heard it a lot in Turkey. So this has something to do with with I think the rather problematic ways in which taksim improvisation is being taught. Secondly, we have a very modern conception of what the taksim improvisation is, and it has a lot to do with the Baghdad school. It has a lot to do with Munir Bashir. It has, a lot to do with this idea of, this is what a taksim is, this is what a taksim sounds like, this is what a taksim should be. Now, listen to the early recordings, as I spent a lot of time doing with my friends in Oxford Maqam. Listen to Akkad, playing on the Qanun. Listen to those taksims; they're completely different. He's doing different. Listen to Tamburi Jamil Bey. Okay, everybody idealizes the Tamburi Jamil Bey taksim improvisations, but he's doing crazy stuff in these improvisations. He's not. He's not following a textbook. Prescription. He's just doing all sorts of stuff, and it flows into his compositions. And you hear a phrase from a Peshrev there, and you hear a phrase from a Semai there. I mean, now that is a kind of creativity taking place within the bounds of taksim improvisation that I think are still there are still doors there that can be opened. I think there are still directions within this tradition that can be explored creatively. So if you were to ask me, do I see a fundamental dividing line between this thing called taksim or taqasim and this thing called, improvisation, music that is irtijali or something like that in some way? I would rather not be fixated on the difference between these two things. I'm interested in traditions. I happen to think that the taksim tradition, if one is to understand it broadly enough, is I think still one that allows for, a tremendous amount of creativity. It doesn't always have to be on unfortunately, the kind of conservatory model that I'm afraid we seem to be a little stuck with. Certainly in parts of the Arab world and certainly in Turkey as well. My Turkish colleagues in the conservatory there, they would Şehvar Beşiroğlu, who was who sadly passed away, very, very good friend of mine. This was a conversation we often had before she died, and she would be agreeing with what I'm saying.
Yeah. So is that a potential research that we expect? Broad research?
Well, I tell you what is happening is what I'm trying to do with my contribution to Oxford Maqam, and we're looking at this Nahda era repertory, as Tariq Bashir was telling you about in his podcast. So I'm, listening to the Akkads playing the Qanun. I'm listening to Ali Rashidi playing the Qanun. I'm listening to that sort of early generation of people on the Qanun. Now, of course, they're playing different instruments. The instruments were different then. They didn't have the urub. There's a different technique. We can't really know that technique because we don't have moving pictures. So it's very difficult to figure out, just how people are playing that rapid kind of sort of tremulando kind of style.
Yeah.
But to the extent possible, what I'm trying to do is to listen to this and figure out a way of reproducing what they're doing as the basis for my own efforts to improvise. So it's a way of saying that sometimes we can go forwards by going backwards. And this is something that is taking shape in my playing at the moment, that ultimately I think I'm going to be in a position to explore more analytically, if you will, in writing and in music notation. But it's a big question for me, and there's just so many angles to get your head around. It's not a small thing what you're talking about here.
Interesting. Okay, working in anthropology colleges versus the musicology.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, you've got some great questions there. Again, a big topic. So in an anthropology department, everyone's saying, what is this thing called music? You know, why is it important to us as human beings? You know, why is it a cultural universal? Is it possible to imagine life without music? What does it do? What does it add to our existence? So the questions were always on that general kind of level. In a music department, you don't have that because everybody thinks they know the answer to it. But in anthropology departments, they don't. So that kind of rather fundamental question, you know, you're always expected to kind of come up with an answer to that. You know, big kind of questions about history and archaeology and, you know, when did it start, you know, and what can we know about its origins, as well as where it's going. I will say this, though, about a music department. So in an anthropology department, I feel at a fundamental level, everybody knows what they think about most subjects. Right? There are furious debates and arguments, but things take place within a rather narrow bandwidth. In a music department, by contrast, you've got all sorts of different kinds of people. You have composers, you have performers, you have people working with ancient manuscripts, you have people looking at the present day, you have people working on the European tradition, you have people working on kind of global musical traditions. You've got people working in music technology, you know, and composition, which is now very kind of computer based. You've got music psychologists. So in a typical music department, you've got people who come from all sorts of different intellectual formations and backgrounds, and the only thing that we have in common is this word music. It turns out that this word music, it means something different to absolutely all of us. So what I find interesting and what I find most energizing about a music department, and particularly the music department that I'm in at the moment, is we end up having some quite complicated but fundamental questions about what we think music is, what counts as a musical fact, what counts as a musical object, what counts as a valid argument about music. And in many ways, I find these questions kind of quite serious, actually. And the diversity of interest that you have in a typical music department in a university in the UK is makes for a very lively and interesting thing at the moment.
Yes.
So I've been happy in a music department. I've been happy actually with my switch back to musicology.
How about, you know, the experience of teaching and research in the States versus the UK?
Well, some of these issues have already come up. I think, you know, one aspect has to do, if you're interested in the Middle East, is that if you're teaching in America, there is just so much that you can't say and that you can't do. There is a kind of censorship in the land of the free. I would have said about you know, anything, and Israel Palestine, I think, is just, you know, is always the elephant in the room. But other things too. I mean, if you wanted to talk about Armenia and the Ottoman history, you know, I mean, there are all sorts of just areas in which you just can't go. The UK, for all of our problems and for all of its problematic relationship to our colonial past, I think is, in a funny way, I think much more open to these kinds of questions and discussions. In the States, I would contrast life in what are effectively private institutions to life in the United Kingdom, which is predominantly in public institutions. So I think that makes for a very significant difference in what it is that you think that you're doing, who you're responsible for.
Yeah, interesting. What is the scene of the folk music in the UK today?
It's good. I've a little bit out of touch with it, but what keeps on striking me is that you know, we talk about revivals and the folk music revivals, and then there was the 1960s revival, and then there was the 1970s revival, and you know, with Ewan McCall and Peggy Seeger, folk music keeps on getting revived in our country, and it goes quiet for a little while, and then a new generation discovers it and makes it their own. And I've been really happy to see my own children develop at various points in their life a very passionate attachment to folk music
Mm.
and to the young generation of folk musicians. Oxford Maqam, our friends there, we all interact actually quite a lot with folk music worlds. Giles Lewin, who used to play with us in Oxford Maqam, is a very distinguished folk music fiddle player, violin player. It's sometimes it seems to me to be invisible to outsiders, and I'm always having this conversation with my Turkish friends. Oh, you don't have a folk culture in England. It's rubbish. They just haven't bothered to look for it. It's very strong. Actually, it's very strong. It seems to me to be in a very good place at the moment. The thing about folk music is that you can encounter it, you can learn it informally. You don't need to go to a school or a college to learn it. You can develop your own skills, and you can find communities that are going to listen to you and are going to support you. And that life is that life and that kind of institutional space, I suppose you could say, in an informal sense, is still very alive in English culture, and it's certainly very alive in Welsh, Scottish, and Irish culture.
Yeah, I understand from what we have discussed so far, the variety of area of interests, but I am sure there are furthermore other interests of research topics, right?
Well, I think over the course of our conversation, I haven't kept many secrets from you. I certainly have always considered myself a rather interdisciplinary person, so I read what's interesting across many different fields. If you're a musicologist, of course you're interested in music, but of course you're also interested in writing. And writing about music poses some very interesting and specific challenges. So part of my own particular quest has always been involved thinking about writing, what it means to write, what the written word is, what it does, what it changes, what it can't touch, what it can't connect with. And this means I think I've been a particularly kind of avid reader of literature. And to a certain extent, the European philosophical tradition as well. Because these, for me, are ways of pushing questions about writing. I think writing's still going to be around. Okay, we've entered the era of the podcast. We've entered the era of the voice. We've entered the era of digital communication. I still imagine a world in which I still imagine the zombie apocalypse, in which all of the lights go off, and what's going to be left? We're going to be left with the world of things written on pieces of paper.
Yes.
We're going to be left with a world of writing that goes back to ancient Sumer. It goes back to the ancient Babylonians. It's been around since then. I don't think that's going.
Yes.
So I think the question of what it means to write, and what the written word is, and what the written word leaves us is going to be is a very fundamental question. And that's always interested me. So I read and think about whatever stimulates my thinking and my practice, I suppose you could say, as a writer. I enjoy writing, actually. I love making music, but I also actually enjoy writing. I don't think writing is going to disappear anytime soon.
Yeah, it's a very powerful tool for the thought process. Yeah, I mean, we can't imagine the world without it.
Well, I remember, I'd love to share an anecdote. I sat on the library committee in Chicago at the very beginning of the process of digitizing their record, and I was just a junior member of this committee, and I remember hearing the argument always was, let's digitize all of this so we don't need any space, and then we can use the space for something else.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know what, but just use the space for something. So this was the argument. It was always digitize, and so we can get rid of all of this paper. And the librarians themselves, the community of librarians, they were quite into this idea in the early age of digitization.
Yeah.
I'm talking about, 1999 or something like that. I'm remembering back to. It's almost like remembering a different, era of humanity. And I remember somebody saying, look, what is the point of keeping records? You keep records so that things will last. And he said, even then, he says, the problem with digitization is that you can digitize stuff, but unless you're actually keeping, constantly updating the technology to read that digital imprint, at every point that there's some micro technological revolution, you stand a chance of losing this. He says, if you want to keep something basically forever, he says, print it out, write it down, print it out on acid-free paper. Keep it in a nice cool room away from the light, and you will know that in 4,000 years that piece of paper is still going to be there. Your digital record, he says, you can't know whether it's going to be there in 10 years' time. And it probably won't if you're not smart about it. But put it on a piece of paper, acid-free paper. Just stick it in a vault somewhere and just leave it away from the light. In 4,000 years' time, someone will be able to pick it up and read it. I've never forgotten that. I think it's absolutely right.
Yeah, and one last point before we move on. It's the Brexit decision.
Oh, God. Well, it's, as you can tell from my expression and silence, this is quite an emotional topic. Personally, I think it's a mistake. Personally, I think we arrived at the decision through a very faulty mechanism. I don't think people knew what they were voting for in this referendum. I think it was manipulated in some very problematic ways, and I think it produced genuinely it produced a false result. We're stuck with it. I think once that result had come up, there was no going back on it. So once that decision had been taken, which I considered to be a disastrous decision, I was always of the view that there was no alternative but to implement it. So here we are. The problem is we have a genuinely incompetent government at the moment who seem to be caught somewhere between their own incompetence and their own intuition that chaos is actually going to serve their interests quite well. And I think we are genuinely heading towards chaos. We're right on the brink of that at the moment, and I only hope that in a year's time we'll be looking back at the moment that I'm speaking and thinking, well, maybe it didn't turn out so bad. But at the moment, we have no trade agreement. We have seemingly nobody who's actually capable of negotiating in good faith on our side. Frankly, I'm not sufficiently sophisticated to really understand what's going on the other side, and I think we're heading to we've created a real problem for ourselves. I wish I could say more without sounding very upset about this, but I think it's, we've got the COVID situation going on at the time, which is a kind of distraction. COVID will eventually, the virus will eventually sort this out. But Brexit, I think, is going to change the face of our country and change the face of Europe for a long time, actually. Anyway, there it is.
Yeah. Now
it is what it is, as they say.
It is what it is. Yeah. What matters the most for Martin the musician?
I almost don't know how to answer that without saying that a lot of things happen. I think, obviously, if I had to put a word at play here, I would have said people matter the most, because music is about people. Communicating about music is communicating about people with people. The well-being of people, the flourishing of people, is the most important thing. My earnest belief is that music is a very significant way in which we can build that flourishing, the flourishing of people. And with that flourishing, I think, important things. These words that we throw around, like, progress, moving. And at the end of the day, I think that if it produces friendship, I think all things then rest on a very secure basis. Knowledge rests on a very secure basis. I think fairness and equality, that I think rests on a very secure basis. I think creativity, progress in the arts, I think rests on a very secure basis. But friendship is an elusive thing. But when I think of the people I've learned most about music, they've all been people who I regard at a very deep level as being friends. So in a way, I think that sort of that grounds everything for me. I find it very, very difficult to imagine, learning something from somebody I don't have that emotional connection with. So building that, kind of creating the circumstances in which that can happen in and through music is, I think, the most important thing.
Martin, where would people find you online or your work?
Well, actually, that's a good question. I've gone through a slightly chaotic phase of my life, which is trying to actually get my digital archives in order. I've been living in the past for quite a long time, but my daughter Katrina has been getting me sorted out in this regard. So more and more, I'm actually constructing something of a digital trace for myself. But I'm afraid, at the moment, other than suggesting to any of your to our listeners who might want to find a few things that I've written and just be able to download them, if they were to find my university web page. So it's just type in my name, Martin Stokes, and King's College London, and a research kind of portal, they call it, comes up, and a certain amount of stuff that I've written recently you can find there in PDF form, and of course I put them there hoping that people will find it. I'm not a lively Facebooker, unfortunately, so that's not a great way to get in touch with me. I'm slightly old-fashioned in that my kind of vital communications tend to take place through email these days.
Better for focus.
And I've got my email. People can find my email through my King's College.
And I think your books are available on some of the academic websites and Amazon.
Yeah, that's true. The two books that I've written about, the book I wrote about arabesque is just coming out in a second edition with Oxford University Press, so that'll be available soon. It never went out of print, but they weren't printing more, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So the second edition is coming out. The Republic of Love, a book I'm proud of, actually, that is still easily available in paperback from Chicago University Press, and for anybody who would like to read it in Turkish, the Turkish translation. Aşk Cumhuriyeti is available from Koç University Press. I have a couple of other volumes. One was a tribute to a professor here who is held in great esteem and affection, called Owen Wright. I don't know whether his name's familiar to you.
Yeah.
But we wrote a little Festschrift volume, me and a friend, Rachel Harris. I think that's my most recent publication, which Routledge published. So yeah, there are a few things, a few volumes around that if anyone's interested, they should be able to find online fairly easily.
Yeah. Martin, I think it's time to listen to some of your playing. What would you choose for the listeners?
Well, you asked me for two things, and I've it was quite an interesting project, and I thought, because I spoke so much about this early training I had in this church school, which was at its time was a very distinguished school. The BBC would often come around and record us singing our hymns and our psalms and our worship. That there's a recording that dates from the 1970s, which I would have been in, and every now and again you can hear my little solo voice as a little boy piping. So I thought I would let you listen to that. So you're going to be listening to actually a piece of liturgical music called a Magnificat, Mary's song to the angel when she's given the news that the baby Jesus is going to be born. And this is a very important part of liturgy that in the Anglican Church is sung every evening, actually every day. So we can listen to that, and it's by a Victorian composer, and just actually at this precise moment I've forgotten whether it's Stanford or Wood or exactly who it is, but it dates from that Victorian Edwardian kind of period when this school, when this choir school was very much in its pomp. So we can listen to that if you would like. So this is, I think, a BBC recording of a church service dating from 1970, and it's a Magnificat.
All right. What about the other text?
And so the second one is I'm very fond of experiments with wax cylinder recording with Oxford Maqam. So we were interested, as you know from your conversations with Tariq Bashir, in the music of the Nahta era, and our source for this are old recordings, and some of these old recordings derive from wax cylinders. I think there are relatively few of these wax cylinders left. But we found a guy called Duncan Smith of Vulcan Records in Sheffield, who actually makes these wax cylinders. He's a kind of enthusiast for this technology. So we thought, Tariq, Ahmed, Yara, we thought, let's just, here's an opportunity to experiment. Why don't we sing back some of this Nahta era washahat and adwar and things like that? Why don't we sing them back into the wax cylinder and just see what we learn from it? Now, there's much to say about this. We learned so much about this music and its sound and how it was put together and how it changed the form and how it changed voices. And we got to the end of this and we thought, well, it doesn't sound so bad. So we stuck it all together on a CD, which we took around our gigs. And I think this is a lovely experiment. And
It is, indeed.
if the first recording was the first recorded sound that you'll hear from me, this is just about the last recorded or the most recent recorded sound that you would hear from me. So it kind of bookends my life. I think we've chosen the Sabah Tahmila, haven't we? So a Tahmila, as you know, is a kind of instrumental, sort of semi-improvised little instrumental number. So that was my second choice. Thanks.
Martin, I would really thank you very much for this great tour of very vivid and diversified experiences of a journey. Thank you very much, really, for that, and I would leave the conclusion to you.
Thank you. It's been a great honor. You've been very generous in giving me the time and the luxury to to think about my life and the people and the things that are important to me. So I really do appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bolton Records, Oxford مقام. يا عواد يا عواد. الله الله يا مصر يا فندم يا حلو. الله 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 احمد يا فندم يا صوت يا الله. يا عواد يا بشير.